Hi everyone, welcome to the last set of slides that will be screencast for you to prepare for week 1 in anatomy physiology. I'd like to continue into a segue from homeostasis. I did talk about feedback mechanisms and I talked about the positive and negative feedback mechanisms. Another thing that happens is an interaction in the body between acids and bases. So as I alluded to earlier in the other slide with pH value of 7.2, that is another parameter that the body needs to be kept in. I can say that from a acidic versus a base environment in the body, things don't work well if it's too acidy, and things don't work well if they're too alkaline. So the same thing has to happen. For example, if any of you work out and lift weights, you'll know that burn that you get when you're pumping iron and the muscle gets increasingly weaker. Part of that is because the lactic acid that is produced in the exercise creates an extremely acidic environment and the muscle can't function properly. So that's kind of a quick example of why it's important to maintain an acidic or an alkaline environment at the proper levels. So the first thing that we need to talk about is an electrolyte. What is an electrolyte? Well, an electrolyte is a solution that contains ions and lots of water. So for example, a lot of you drink these solutions, Gatorade. Gatorade contains things like sugar, potassium, sodium, and so forth. And that is an electrolyte drink, or at least it did start out that way until Coca-Cola purchased it. But that's what your sports drinks are, is that they are an electrolyte solution that's to provide the body chemicals that it requires to function better in light of burning a lot of those chemicals out when we're exercising. The other thing that's really good about electrolytes is that they create an environment where electricity can conduct very quickly. The example I always use in class is if one wanted to commit suicide and they filled the tub up with water and they threw a plugged-in toaster, it's likely they could electrocute themselves. If you really wanted it to function properly, you would provide a bag of salt in the tub of water and then put the toaster in. Because the sodium is an unbelievable conductor of electricity, you would then, electricity would pass into the water and travel through the water, thus resulting in the unfortunate demise of you. The human body uses electricity, minute amounts of it, microcurrents, to do all sorts of things. The diaphragm contracting to breathe, the heart beating to move blood around, skeletal muscle functioning when you do any kind of movement in the human body. The other thing that electrolytes are good for is nervous conduction. So the ability for the brain via the nervous system to speak to the body and have muscles contract and so forth requires electrolytes as well. So you can see that solutions containing lots of ions are vitally important. Another unique property of electrolyte is that when electrolytes are placed in water, so if I take an electrolyte solution and I place it in plain water, they will be divided into positive and negative ions. So the ions that are within there, so some of the in electrolyte solutions, some of the ions are positive and some of the ions are negative. In distilled water, when we put a solution in, those negative and positive ions will actually separate into polar opposites within the water. When we look here in this slide, we'll see that our intake of electrolytes, we need about 250 mils to meet metabolic rates. 30% of electrolytes come from food and 60% come from beverages that we intake every day. Now, we are constantly outputting electrolytes via things such as bowel movements when we go to the bathroom, when we sweat, and insensible losses via skin and lungs. So even when we sweat, just the skin sitting there, and when we are breathing out, we actually lose electrolytes via the moisturized air that leaves the body. And then the vast majority of electrolytes we lose is when we urinate. So you can see here that there needs to be a maintenance of electrolytes in the body at a certain level. and we're constantly trying to replace those via things such as metabolic processes that happen within the body, foods that we eat, and things that we drink. So when we look both intracellularly and extracellularly, in other words, in the cell or outside the cell, we must have a balanced environment both in the cell and outside the cell of the appropriate amounts of acids and bases. And if we don't have a balance between inside the cell and outside the cell, some bad things can happen. The first thing we need to talk about first is what happens in solutions. What makes a solution more acidic and what makes a solution more alkaline? A solution, when we find a great amount of hydrogen, we say that that solution is more acidic. So the more hydrogen ions we find in a solution, the more acidic it becomes. We know that when we take an acidic solution and we place it in water, the solution dissociates into one or more hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions will leave the acidic solution and enter into the water. Conversely, when we're looking at a more alkaline solution or a more base solution, we find more hydroxide ions. So the more hydrogen ions we find in a solution, the more acidic it is. The more hydroxide ions we find in a solution, the more base it becomes, or the more alkaline it becomes. So what happens when we place an alkaline solution in water, we get dissociation of hydroxide ions leaving it. What's interesting is that when we try to mix an acid and a base together, it becomes more base. So when a base is added to an acid, it removes hydrogen from that solution, making it more base. So when we look at maybe adding baking soda to vinegar. Baking soda is more base, vinegar is more acidic. You see the reaction that happens, and it actually does in fact make the vinegar more base. When we look at trying to measure how acidic something is or is not, we base it against a scale. And as I said earlier, the more hydrogen ions that exist in a solution, the more acidic that solution becomes. And the more hydroxide ions in the solution, the more alkaline or basic or base it becomes. When we look at something to see how much acidic it is or how much alkaline it is, so the acidity or alkalinity in a solution is expressed on pH scale. And what pH stands for is percentage of hydrogen. And the scale runs from 0 to 14. And it is based on the concentration of hydrogen in a solution, not of hydroxide. The midpoint, which is distilled water, which is neither alkaline nor acidic, is 7. So 0 to 14 is the scale. 7 is considered to be completely balanced and distilled water, which means it's neither acidic nor alkaline. A salt, when added to water, dissociates into cations and anions, neither of which is hydrogen or hydroxide. So we have three solutions here we're looking at. We're looking at an acidic solution, hydrogen ions, an alkaline solution, hydroxide ions, and a salt which has neither hydroxide or hydrogen in it. But what salt solutions are important for is to carry electrical impulses, such as nerve impulses and muscle contractions. So if I go back to saying that when we add an alkaline solution to an acid, it becomes more alkaline, what it does in that interaction, it actually creates a salt. So think about hydrogen and hydroxide ions canceling each other out, which results in a salt. And as we said, a salt contains neither hydroxide nor hydrogen in it. So we have three things here: salt, hydrogen, and hydroxide. So when we go back to this pH scale, we said that a pH scale measures the percent of hydrogen, and it is the percentage of hydrogen that determines whether a solution is more acidic or more base. And as I said earlier, A pH of 7 is said to be neutral, which is neither nor alkaline nor acidic. As the number moves right, the solution becomes more alkaline. So moving right means it goes greater for 7 to 8 to 9 to 10 to 11 to 12, 13, 14. Okay? As the number moves left, the solution becomes more acidic. So as the number lowers from 7 till 6 to 5 to 4 and so on, it becomes more acidic. Now, when I spoke earlier about balance with homeostasis and I said something as small as 0.2 is catastrophic, that is because that a change of one whole number on this scale results in a 10-fold change in the number of hydrogen ions, 10 times 10. So if we went from 7 to 6, that is a massive change of acidity in the solution. I'll repeat that a change of one whole number on this pH scale results in a 10-fold change in the number of hydrogen ions. If we're in a second here, I'm going to show a slide of a pH scale. We have to understand that various intra and extracellular fluids have specific pH values that they must maintain within this homeostatic parameter. So if we look here, for example, we can see that here is where it's neutral at 7. There's a 1-to-1 ratio of hydrogen to hydroxide. As we move down to a more acidic value, we see that there's 10 to the 0 of hydroxide ions, so almost none. Whereas we have 10 to the power of minus 14, meaning that there is massive amounts of hydrogen ions at this 0 level. Conversely, if we come all the way here to the other end, to 14, this is the most basic solution. We have 10 to the power of 0, almost none hydrogen ions here. Whereas when we look here, we see the basic, we have massive amounts of hydrogen. How do we control acidic environments and alkaline environments? Because the systems want to maintain a parameter, and because a movement of 1 results in massive changes, we can't have a system that is powerful enough to quickly change an acidic environment down the scale from, say, 6 to 5. So we need to have something in place that causes minor changes on the scale, which would allow the body to move one way or the other without catastrophic results from too large a movements. As I said in the last set of slides, homeostatic mechanisms are constantly at work to maintain the appropriate values. So, for example, kidneys removing excess acid through urine. Strong acids are continually created by the body and consumed into the body, but pH levels in the body remain constant. How does this happen? It happens through buffer systems. And the buffer systems, as I said about big changes in the scale, the buffer systems convert strong acids or bases into weak acids or bases. So it's not a huge change. We don't want to move down the scale from 6 to 5 or 7 to 6. We want to make minor changes. So strong acids or bases can ionize easily. In other words, they can release their hydrogen or hydroxide ions into the solution, which could result in a drastic change in pH. Is not good. So we can say that a strong acid or base is unstable, and the release of those compounds into a water solution could result in too great a change, which could result in a very bad environment for certain processes in the body to work. So we want weak acids or bases that release much smaller amounts of hydrogen or hydroxide, thus having less effect on the pH of the environment. And we can express that by saying by moving very little along either direction, left or right, on the pH scale. The compounds that convert the substance into either a weak base or an acid is known as a buffer. A buffer does not really have a whole lot of effect on hydroxide. What it does do, it removes or adds hydrogen. So one example is the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. So carbonic acid is a weak acid and bicarbonate is a weak base. If we find that we have excess hydrogen, the bicarbonate can act as a weak base. Remember, bicarbonate's actual name is sodium bicarbonate. It is a salt. So it is salts that affect the change on an acidic solution becoming less acidic. So bicarbonate can act as a weak base and therefore remove the excess hydrogen from the solution. If there is a shortage of hydrogen, the carbonic acid can act as a weak acid and contribute the needed hydrogen to the solution. So I really want you to think about that it's salts that have an effect on these pH values in the body, and it is the salts that cause minor changes because of this tenfold change that can occur up or down the gradient. Normally in class we tend to do group work, but because I'm doing this with a screencast, I'm going to have you do it by yourselves, and I think we'll talk about it in class as far as this group work goes. But I'm going to present the this piece of paper, and I'm going to sort of escape out of here, bring up the document, and I think we'll work on it a little bit together. So I'm going to read it out loud, and I want you to think about something. Although the human diet is essentially neutral with respect to its pH, various aerobic and anaerobic metabolic processes create large amounts of acid daily from the catabolism of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So what I'm saying is that when we break down things like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, we actually have large amounts of acid that are as a result of that. And as we know, the body needs to maintain a particular constant of hydrogen or acidity, so it's always under bombardment, and it needs to make these changes through buffer systems. So the body maintains a constant hydrogen level such that blood and extracellular pH is near 7.4 and intracellular pH is about 7.1. The buffer most responsible for this is the carbonic acid bicarbonate system, which I just talked about, regulated by the coordinated behavior of the lungs and the kidneys. So this, what I talked about in the acid bicarbonate system, saying that, that the carbonic acid provides hydrogen if required, and the bicarbonate system actually is a base and lowers hydrogen within the environment to maintain that level, is all taking place in the lungs or the kidneys. Aerobic metabolism yields gaseous CO2 that combines with water to form volatile carbonic acid, H2CO3. So what happens is when we're exercising and we're breathing, that carbon dioxide that's being created as part of the system is actually acidic. So you end up producing vast amounts of acidic volatile carbonic acid when you exercise. So somehow we have to get rid of it. The lungs are primarily responsible for the elimination of CO2. Anaerobic metabolism of glucose and fat, as well as some protein catabolism, yield fixed or non-volatile acids such as lactic acid, sulfuric acid, and phosphoric acid, most being excreted by the kidneys. So we have one mechanism that controls acidic levels by exhalation, and we have another system that controls acidic values by getting rid of it through fluids via the kidneys. In a 24-hour period, a 70-kilogram person produces between 70 and 100 millimoles of such non-volatile acids versus 20 moles of CO2, which is resulting in volatile carbonic acid, all without appreciable change in plasma pH. An effective alveolar ventilation, that's the exchange of gas at the alveoli in the lungs, controls CO2 or carbon dioxide excretion, while the kidneys excrete non-volatile acids and reabsorb or regenerate bicarbonates. The lungs and kidney maintain a balance of CO2 and HCO3 and thus a pH near 7.4. So we see here then, between the lung and the kidneys, we maintain a balance of 7.4. So there is always pressure on this system via aerobic metabolism, so the fact that you're utilizing oxygen in your cells and tissues and you have a byproduct of CO2, that's always putting pressure on the system because CO2 is acidic, so you breathe it out. And then things like muscle contraction and the production of lactic acid, as an example, is also pressuring the system, and therefore lactic acid is metabolized by the liver, and as well the non-volatile acids are also excreted via the kidneys. Okay, so I have a question for you that I'll bring in class, and that is the following. Just give me a moment here. Okay, so question number 1. What would happen if a lung disease resulted in the patient's inability to exhale appropriate amounts of CO2? So what would happen? Under normal circumstances, when you breathe out, you are easily getting rid of all the CO2, and you are able to maintain the homeostatic values of the proper pH. But what would happen in a lung disease where you can't get rid of CO2 and CO2 is allowed to build up? There's the clue. So I'll give you a second to think about it, and then I'll kind of give a bit of an answer here. So, as I said on the pH scale, a full point is tenfold. So, just going from 7.4 normal, the collection of CO2 in the lung and the patient's inability to breathe out CO2 would result in the buildup of volatile acids, and therefore would influence the pH value of the system to start to lower. And to get a sense of this tenfold change when we move down 1, if the pH is allowed to get as low as 7.2 from the normal 7.4, death is imminent. And we have to realize that, just a change of 0.2 could be catastrophic to the processes of the body. Where does this happen? It can happen in a condition that is known as COPD. You may know it as emphysema or chronic bronchitis. So these kind of patients who have not got the ability to breathe out CO2 can result in changing the acidic environment of the body, and death could be imminent if someone does not step in to make a change here in the body. Thank you for listening. This is the last slides. We'll be working from here on in through class. I hope you found them a benefit, and we will see you next week. At this point, we may even see you before that. Thanks for listening.